Money. Money.
Housing construction in Seattle is setting records while other local suburbs are at record lows. Despite the record construction spree in Seattle, housing growth is actually down a bit this decade across King County as a whole. This is because development in the suburbs has plunged from the historical average. For decades, housing construction in King County looked about how you'd expect. Seattle, which is about 1/3 of the county's population, built about 1/3 of the region's new housing. The suburbs that make up the rest of the county built the rest. But now that it has all changed, Seattle is building housing like never before, and the housing growth has slowed significantly for the suburbs. The shift is a result of a combination of developers chasing the biggest profits in Seattle, where housing demands have gone through the roof, and the Seattle leaders have opened up floodgates for bigger buildings, and suburbs restricting new construction through zoning laws that all but ban new housing in most parts of the region. Now, overall, Seattle housing construction has grown 130% this decade compared to the average over the prior 3 decades, while housing developments in the suburbs have dropped 43% from its historical average. And it all up, and in the county as a whole, as actually on pace for slight decline in the overall number of homes being built in this decade, despite Seattle's building frenzy. That's only part of the explanation for decades. Local suburbs also built quite a lot of apartments, condos, townhouses, and other dense forms of housing from 1980 to 2010. Now, Seattle counted for about 40% of all apartments and other multifamily buildings built in King County. This is crazy. For decades that the suburbs actually built more apartments than Seattle. Now, this decade, Seattle has built 70% of the county's dense housing, despite having only 15% of the country's development land. Now, when looking just at apartments and other multifamily buildings, construction is down 27% in the suburbs from its historical average. Now, the biggest difference now is that vacant development land isn't nearly as abundant as it used to be. So this means to add housing, they need to redevelop some of the already existing, like parking lot and little strip malls. Now, Seattle's doing this in a big way, completely transforming some of the low-density neighborhoods and towers and block-long apartments mid-size, while the suburbs have done this in a much more measured way, or in some cases, not at all. Overall, housing growth in the suburbs this decade has lagged a bit behind the even average of the state, where demands of housings are less intense. Now, the reason housing construction has slowed down, it's because fewer people want homes. Just the opposite. In the past, the few years in King County has rocketed up the charts and the most expensive place to buy a home or rent an apartment. A big factor in the housing demand is the job growth, which lures people to move here, and the balance between job and housing growth has changed too. So the region's actually built housing is a little more quickly than it adds jobs in the 1990s and in the 2000s. So in other words, it roughly built enough homes for people who are in need, helping prevent the intense competition that has pushed up home prices and rents. So for the decade, the number of new jobs has soared twice as fast in the new housing. That holds true even in the account for efforts of rescission by looking just in the last 5 years. So specifically, housing growth in Seattle has nearly kept pace with jobs, but not in the suburbs. It's not like builders have that many options. All but a couple of the small strips in the city zone exclusively for single-family homes. The same is true throughout the King County. The trend of housing being funneled into Seattle and away from the suburbs is likely to continue. So right now, Seattle has 62% of all apartments under construction in King County, according to the Department Insight Real Data, which tracks construction and planning of buildings with at least 50 units. In the country suburbs, Redmond and Bellevue, host more than half of the apartments underway now. So looking further into the future, the forecast calls for an even stronger deliverance. Seattle has 82% of all the apartments planned, but not yet under construction in King County amongst the large buildings. So there are more apartments planned in the core of downtown Seattle than all of the county's suburbs combined. Not all of the units will be built, but still, Seattle has nearly 28,000 apartments in the pipeline, while all suburbs combined have about 6,000 planned amongst large buildings. So interesting data. I just wanted to share with you here a little bit about what's going on in Seattle compared to everywhere else in King County. Coming up next on the Money Hour, the 9 best ways to make the most of your marketing table, event sponsorship, and come home with clients, connections, collaboration, and cast. Nancy Jutton of Nancy Jutton Marketing right here at 1150 a.m. KKNW after the short break.